You're listening to the Spiritual Banks podcast.
Hey, beautiful listeners. So this is it. This is episode 1, and we are excited to be here. And we are excited to have you guys even interested in listening to what we have to say. And I guess I should fill you in on who we is. So without further ado, sir, introduce yourself.
My name is Cris Banks.
And who are you, Cris Banks?
I'm your husband.
What? That's right. We're married.
That's right.
I guess that makes me your wife.
Indeed it does.
Yeah. How long have we known each other, in this life?
5 going on 6 years now.
That's crazy to think about.
It truly is.
It really is.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, the whole point of this episode is to interview each other without it being awkward. So
We'll do our best.
we'll do our best. We just want to take some space so that you guys get to know who we are and what our background is and why we want to do this. And I know I've been told, so I teach, and I've been told several times, man, you should really do a podcast. But I also know that with that amazing voice of yours, you must have been told more than once to do something with it.
Indeed I have.
Yeah.
And over the years I have done several things with this voice.
Yes.
Besides the day-to-day communication that we all do, I've also done some voiceover work, done commercials, college radio stuff, friends and family who have friends that need something done, a little voice clip here and there, a little commercial here and there. Not a whole lot, and I've never really advertised.
Yeah.
But it's one of those things that probably for the last 10 years I've had people ask me randomly, hey, do you do voice work?
Yeah.
Are you on the radio?
You are now.
I am now. And so it's finally happening.
Yeah, your voice kind of precedes you. Like it is one of, besides your eyes, right? Whenever someone sees you, like it's your eyes, and then it's that voice.
It has shocked a few people.
Yeah. Well, I'm just grateful I get to listen to it every day. So it's interesting because I feel like we have really good conversations all the time. Especially before we were, together when we were friends. And not that we don't have good conversations now, we just have life conversations now. But the spiritual conversations we would find ourselves in when we first met or when we'd hang out in a group, I felt like, man, I wish somebody would have recorded those because there was some really good shit in there.
Indeed.
And I like the idea of the casual aspect of sitting down with someone you know and you're comfortable with and talking about things that can be outside of the realm of like normal and could sometimes even be uncomfortable, but you get someone else's perspective on it. And I don't know. I don't exactly know how this idea was birthed. It just kind of happened. And so having your support and also just your interaction in it, I think it's going to be really good for listeners. So thank you.
I concur. You're welcome.
Let's see. I do want to point out that it's important that you feel safe speaking about whatever you want to speak about. If you don't want to speak about anything, that's okay too. But even as listeners, just setting up that safe space to explore, does this resonate with me? Or is this something that feels like I don't need to take it on? And so I just want to say to you listeners that, if it's not for you, leave it at the door. You don't have to take it with you every time you listen. So
On that note, a lot of times people will feel uncomfortable talking about their spiritual beliefs or things that might not even be considered spiritual, but come across as deeply personal.
right.
And one of the things that I have come across, because I personally seek out these types of conversations,
Yeah.
I really enjoy them.
Yeah.
And I value that, and I hold a space for those who want to share something that is as deeply personal as spiritual beliefs or questions that they may have or things that they've never felt comfortable sharing with other people. And for those listening, I like to use a example, and that is when you go to the grocery store. Usually people go to the grocery store because they have a hunger for something. When you go to the grocery store, you don't get a shopping cart and fill your cart with everything on the shelves. And that's a great example of what attitude we come into this podcast, and an attitude that you can bring with you as you share these moments with us. Just know that you don't have to take everything, and just take whatever you feel will nourish you, whatever you need. And we're offering that.
I like that.
Enjoy.
Enjoy. So I guess this is the part where we talk about like what our experiences spiritually have been, like what has led us to this moment, you know. I don't know if you want to go first or if you want me to go first.
I'll let you go first.
Oh, that's sweet. Ladies first. Well, some of you might actually know me as Brandy Chrisman. And especially professionally, I think 12 years I went by Brandy Chrisman. So a lot of people don't know the Nicole Banks name. And Nicole is just my middle name. And I thought it resonated with me more. There was just this story behind my first name, you know, of how we're named. And I no longer wanted to receive that as my truth of my makeup and who I was. And maybe that's like for another episode, right? But I thought Nicole resonated with me a lot more. And then, of course, marrying you, I took on your last name. So it sounds kind of like Hollywoodish. It's like Nicole Banks. I could be in a 007 movie.
You could.
Yeah, I could. Right. So I guess we should start with, I grew up pretty psychically aware, I'm told. I don't know that I had that awareness while I was actually little, but I remember my uncle telling me that he used to bring his girlfriends to me. And if I liked them, he knew it was going to be a good relationship. And if I didn't like them, he knew he needed to break up with them.
Wow.
And he said the only one that I liked was his first wife, my Aunt Laura. And they had a really long, good, you know, relationship. They were married for a long time.
Yeah.
And so I thought that was interesting. But I always also remember, like, knowing when something was wrong with my parents. And it's not necessarily, I don't think, because they acted different. I would know, like, what our financial state was without them saying anything. And so I was really perceptive with things like that, like things going on around me. And always just like a really, really vivid dreamer. So I would dream and then things would, you know, months later come true. Sometimes it was years later. But yeah, that was kind of like my first beginnings, was like just kind of a psychic kid without really knowing it. I didn't grow up in something that would have supported us being psychic. Despite having a grandfather who does astrology and is a published author, and we kind of grew up. I think at first I don't really remember spirituality or religion, and then I would say about 5th grade we started going to church, so 4th or 5th grade, and so from then to the age of 18, I was in the Baptist church. So, what about you? What was your childhood like?
I want to ask you, before I get into my background, which I do have some similarities to that, and I'll get into in a little bit. But when you were growing up, from the point in which you started going to church, what was your influence when it came to spiritual gifts? What did you see? What did people tell you? And what was your general understanding of spiritual gifts? And how did you fit into that?
That's a really good question, Mr. Banks.
You're welcome.
You know, we weren't a church that talked about the gift of prophecy or anything like that. There was no speaking in tongues. There was not an awareness at all that there were spiritual gifts. And anything that kind of came from that realm of seeing the future or, spirits, that was all the devil's work, for lack of better terminology. It was the devil coming into your life and wreaking havoc. And so, to answer your question, there was no reference for that, which I think was a disservice, because you shove it down, or you start to label yourself as bad, or that something is out to get you. And, it can create this instability, this conflict within self. So, it's a good question.
That's a good answer.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. So I grew up in the Methodist church, and my family went to church ever since I was born. I grew up in the same church my whole life until I was about 18, and then I went to a non-denominational church. The Methodists are known for having a pretty liberal outlook when it comes to the Christian denominations, and so it was they had a very traditional service with the robes and the pastor and the hymns and all of the classic things. The church I went to was in a classic Gothic style, and so it was very pretty, and
I bet it was
lovely organ music and all of that stuff that you think of from the high church.
Right.
But they also had a contemporary service for the youth, and that was more like the non-denominational church that I went to afterwards. The youth group had a rock band and played more the kind of music that you would hear on the Christian radio station.
Yeah, that's how our youth group was as well.
And so I got a great exposure to, I'd say a well-rounded exposure to both sides. And I ended up going to this non-denominational service over at a non-denominational church because of my girlfriend at the time, and had a great time. Really, I would say this, I've always been seeking, and I've always had what I feel is an unmistakable connection to God.
Yeah.
And a lot of Christians will relate to that. A lot of Christians may not relate to that. A lot of people may or may not relate to that. But I guess this is why we're having this conversation. I went to another non-denominational church up in Kansas City when I was about 19. I moved up there. And that church was IHOP, International House of Prayer, unlike International House of Pancakes. And they had this prayer room, and it was a church of sorts that offered 24-hour worship music.
That's awesome.
Live worship music, and they had people that would pray for you. And it was open to the public. And at that time in my life, I'd gone through a lot of loss when it came to relationships with my family, a lot of drama related around those breakdowns of relationships, and being a young adult trying to find my own way, knowing deep down that there was a peace that was found in seeking out the refuge of being in the Spirit, if you will, being surrounded by, in that case, at IHOP, relaxing music that was uplifting and spiritually focused. It was really a time of rest for me. And after that, I attended, well, let me say this, during that season of my life, as I was seeking rest, I was also exposed to some quite profound spiritual warfare situations. Yeah. Not with myself, but with close friends of mine. And it really...
And it's interesting because if you would have said that to me, I think you did say that to me like 5 years ago, and I was like, spiritual warfare. But no, like, I think getting out of my own ego for a moment, and having experiences develop in my life you know, it's there. It's definitely there. And I would not have said that, especially like in a circle, you know, or a workshop. I would not have said that even, I don't know, a year and a half ago. But I know some people are going to listen to this and they're going to cringe immediately at the phrase spiritual warfare, but it's legit.
It is. What I experienced, without going into too much detail, because that's a whole podcast in of itself.
Yeah.
I saw some supernatural things that were just physically unexplainable. And it was very scary, to be honest.
Yeah.
It was scary for myself being witness to it. And it was certainly scary for those who I knew that were being affected by it. And in those moments, you know, it's really a trial by fire in a sense. I felt the compulsion to pray. To pray in a sense that I was interceding for those who were being attacked, to use that phrase. And I felt that there was so much going on that I did not understand. And I think part of that is my nature, just wanting to understand, always being curious. I was that kid growing up that always had questions.
Why? Why? But
Well,
why?
how does that work?
But why?
And unfortunately, as a young child, I had a learning disability, and so I couldn't read very well, to the chagrin of all the adults around me, because had I been able to read well, they would have just given me books to kind of pacify my constant curiosities. However, getting back to that stage in my life, I realized that I needed to understand that side of my spirituality. I needed to understand that there were things that were going on, and I needed to understand how prayer worked.
Yeah.
And I needed to understand that in a way that was not just something that people were telling me, but something that I could understand the mechanics of and practice in my life.
Right.
And I would say there's a term that people use a lot, which is effective prayer. I mean, there are different types of prayer.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I realized was prayer is always genuine whenever it is coming from your soul.
Yeah.
And there's no reason to feel inadequate to pray over anything. I was hungry for understanding more of the mechanics, to understand the different types of prayer that would help in those situations. And so I sought after understanding. There was kind of a debriefing, if you will, after that event, after several of those events. And I realized that the people that I was speaking to that had the answers, they all went to the same church. And that was one of those spirit-filled, it wasn't Pentecostal, but it was pretty close to it.
Yeah.
And they dealt with spiritual warfare almost on a service basis.
Yeah.
They had 4 services a week.
Jeez.
And I jumped in and attended every chance I could get.
Really? So you were really pulled towards it?
I was captivated by it.
Yeah.
I was captivated by those who were knowledgeable of what was going on and had a confidence in how to address it without the fear.
Do you ever feel like witnessing any of that during the service or during a given service? Do you ever feel like any of that was inauthentic?
I feel like some of the attendees were striving. And I think in some of their striving, I think some of that was manufactured, if you will. And just to give the listeners an understanding of what I mean by that, because I'm not picking on anyone. A lot of times, if you've grown up in church, you've been witness to a worship song, and you'll see people raising their hands, And traditionally that's done in a way of showing surrender.
Right.
A lot of times people will do that in a way to kind of stir up that feeling of I'm surrendering.
Right.
And I felt like in a lot of those cases, I felt like some of the people were just doing that to fit in, or to feel like they were participating in the energy of that service in particular.
I think what always fascinates me in group situations like that is the psyche. And of course, you know me, so you know that I look at every level and not just the spiritual or the physical. You know, you want to look at every angle of it. And what can happen in a group situation like that, in which someone feels moved in a specific way, and then it's almost like the psyches of others come out to play. And the trauma of others, or this, the psychology, whatever it actually is, the mind is powerful.
Indeed.
And so that's why I asked that question, because I know that there were things when I would visit, like, not that this whole episode is about church, right? But when I would visit a friend's church that, I think it was actually a Pentecostal church, to see these people in a way that I didn't have experience with, be so moved into fits of, for lack of better terminology, possession. I remember laughing like the first few times and being like, what is wrong with them? And it was very clear that with some, it was more severe than others. And it was very clear that some of these people, you couldn't like snap them out of it. But I remember the ones that were just like perfectly fine afterwards. And I always questioned that. Like, they were just perfectly fine. Like, they were just possessed. All of these people, all of these men came over and started speaking tongues over them. And then they just got up and walked out. Like, it was fine. And I thought, there's something not right about that. But hearing your experiences, I think kind of helps me get like a different view of it, right? Not that it was your experiences alone that changed my mind, but I think it must have been a really powerful experience for you to keep going back to every service that you could attend and try to learn that. And it's actually, I mean, in my connection with you and within mediumship, that knowledge was almost immediately put to work, which might be another episode that we talk about,
Sure.
Our mediumship journey together. But I don't want to cut you off, but tell me more about what you've studied outside of the church.
Sure. I think that's a natural progression. And what you mentioned about the psyche playing into that group, or the group psyche, that can be a function of services that are almost always deemed a spiritual warfare or an outpouring of the Holy Spirit, either one. But having that spiritual ecstasy of a moment, whether positive or negative, deemed by those who are witness and participant in it. That was one of the aspects that I recognized, and it was always one-sided. It was always, this is either of God or of the devil.
Right. And
after that period of attending that church, I ended up moving back to Oklahoma. It was probably about 2 years after attending that church that I ended up moving back. And I came across, in my hunger for understanding, the Urantia book. And
which I had never even heard of before you.
and most people haven't. At that time, I was reading through the Dead Sea Scrolls. Just to put it out there, I've read the Bible cover to cover. I always had a hunger for learning what truths were in that book. That's the most unequivocally the most
In the Bible.
in the Bible,
Yeah.
unequivocally the most impactful book in the world.
Right. Absolutely.
It has shaped Western culture more than any other text.
Yeah.
And so after reading through it, and of course going to church your whole life and Bible studies your whole life, and eventually having a lot of questions, that you find out, wait, there are all these other books out there. And I feel like it was baby steps for me, because I did grow up with that fear of other religions and that fear of other spiritual paths having something that would lead me astray.
Yeah, which is what, for those that didn't grow up in the church or are not in the church, that is the main, like one of the main common denominators in teaching, other than the Bible itself. And even that is, malleable by who is preaching it to you. But that is the main thread of like, do not be led astray.
Yeah.
You just have blinders on. And so I understand. Yeah.
Well, what was key to that season of my life in making that baby step, those slow baby steps, or maybe I guess you could say a leap into a revelatory text that was not the Bible, was what I had realized and what I had seen and found to be true within myself, was that anything that was not of God, anything that was not pure, had associated with it a fear.
Yeah.
It had a fear aspect to it. And that was something that I recognized in everyone who I saw struggling, whether it was struggling with their faith, whether it was struggling with an addiction, whether it was struggling in a relationship, whether it was struggling mentally. There was always a fear associated with every one of those struggles.
Yeah.
And what I saw was through the surrender, through letting go of that fear, there was an opportunity for grace to come in, and there was an opportunity for God, for the Holy Spirit, for liberation, for that person's soul to blossom into their truer self.
Right.
And so it was that allowed me to start looking into extra biblical texts, realizing that so much of the Bible is referencing these characters that are referenced in these other books. And so through my research, I came across the Urantia book. And the Urantia book truly opened my eyes to a whole new world of spiritual revelation. I mean, it is truly unlike it's like somebody who's never seen the Bible or come across it has a revelation of, wow, there's this combined text of all of these things with all these spiritual principles.
And it's a massive book. It's intimidating. I remember when you handed it to me, like, early on in our friendship, and you were like, check this book out. And I was like, I can't carry that book. It's heavy. But yeah, and you open it up and you're like, where the heck do I start?
And heavy is a good word to describe it physically and metaphorically. It covers a great deal of concepts. In fact, the first segment of the book is the heaviest aspect, dealing with divinity, dealing with spirituality, spiritual nature in reference to the human evolution.
Yeah, and I've still yet to read it. Like, I like our little calendar on our windowsill that has, like, really good quotes from it. And I'm like, oh, that's great. Yeah. But it's intimidating.
It is.
So it's impressive that you've taken the time to chew on that.
Well, I was hungry.
Yeah, true.
I was hungry. And so I ended up reading through I kind of cherry picked through it because having the foundation of understanding the Bible and the history and all of the spiritual, not all of them, but many of the spiritual context that are sewn throughout it, I was able to use that as a springboard into the Urantia book, because so much of it is commentary on the Bible itself.
Yeah.
Commentary on the history of religions.
Yeah. And is it a channeled work? Would you call it that?
There's a lot of debate on that. It is proclaimed a revelatory book, and it was channeled. However, there are so many things that are channeled that are not anywhere comparable to the Urantia book.
They just don't have the meat and the truth, I suppose, that has moved people. It is a unique text that stands on its own merit, is what I could say. Which is hard
about
to
it.
do.
Truly.
Truly. As a writer, as someone who writes, I'm not published, but I've written seriously, I've started at least 20 books. I've fully written 2. So it's one of those things where even feeling like you have the confidence to put a book out into the world that could stand on its own merit, I don't know. It just doesn't exist, at least not in my realm of things. And, my papa is a published author. And that's, he doesn't do spiritual texts. But I guess I have 2 grandfathers that are public authors? Published authors.
Published authors.
Yeah. We'll get there. Which is interesting. I've never really thought about that. But Papa does, crime novels. He does murder mysteries. But yeah, to have a book be able to stand on its own merit and just be an entity of itself, I think it's unheard of these days. I have not heard of a book that can do that. I mean, there are good books, but they all preach kind of the same, every self-help book, especially coming out now, is the same. And they're all grabbing from each other, which is fine. It's all the same message, and that's beautiful. But yeah, I think that's really unique. Yeah.
Yeah. So wrapping up my story, after going down the path on the adventure of discovering what the Urantia book had in store, I had several more spiritual experiences that were rather profound, and they led me into being aware of those on the other side, meaning those who had passed on.
Dun, dun, dun.
Da, da, da. And those who had passed on communicating with me. And without going into all those stories, because that's a whole podcast in of itself, I ended up, long story short, having these experiences of just having a knowing about people, having a knowing of those on the other side, being within the room.
Within the room.
And even having them speak to me in ways that I wasn't seeking out, and I wasn't exploring, but happened spontaneous. And one of the things,
I challenge you with that, because spiritual communication is never spontaneous. It's when the student is ready,
That's true. That's very true.
Continue.
In those moments, I felt it was spontaneous.
Right.
And they started to occur on a frequency that was undeniable. And through a mutual friend of ours, I was told to reach out to this medium who she thought I would be able to work with and be able to have an understanding of what was going on. And it was you.
It was me?
It was you.
It was me. I know the story. I shouldn't act like I don't know.
And that is how we met each other.
Yeah. It's kind of cool to think that I've been able to witness I assume what is a lot of your mediumship journey. So yeah, I think that's beautiful. We'll have to talk some other episode about our mediumship work, because I just feel like that's something that needs to happen. But thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome.
For me, let's talk about me.
Yeah. How did you get into your mediumship journey?
Yeah, it's weird to think about, really, because it happened. I feel like it happened to me for a while. I was 14 when I first started having dreams of people who had passed, and it was people I knew. And that's a young age to be exposed to death, especially like death of a peer. But I had a girl that I went to church with, and I also went to school with her brother. For whatever reason, she didn't go to the same school that we did, which is fine. I don't know what that reason was, but went to church with her. Her brother didn't come to our church, but I did go to school with him. And her name was Ashley, and she was sweet, just this sweet, tiny. She was tall and thin and had this red, beautiful red hair, and soft-spoken. But I got to know her a little bit. She was best friends with one of my best friends in the church, who was a male. And so I had all of these ties to her, is what I'm trying to build here. And I remember having had bronchitis really badly when she died. And so there was this want to really go to her service, but I was too sick. And I had missed too much school, and my mom was not having it.
Ain't nobody got time.
Ain't nobody got time to fail. And so, it was the night of her service. I went to bed. So her service had happened, and I immediately fell into a dream, which is a funny way to put it, to fall into a dream, but in which we were standing in the back of the church that we attended. And she was in this beautiful white gown. And I have no idea to this day what she was buried in. But it reminded me of just purity, basically, And she had died of a brain tumor, cancer that had just riddled her body. And so she had lost all of her hair. She was pretty gaunt. And she looked healthy when I was in the stream with her, and she had all of her hair. And without speaking, she said, "Just tell them I'm okay. Just tell them I'm okay." And I remember waking up from that, and I was just sobbing. But I didn't know what to do with it, because then again, we talk about spiritual gifts not being accepted. That definitely wouldn't have been accepted. And so I sat on it. And then I lost a teacher that I really liked. His name was Mr. Rogers, and we had I was the newspaper editor and the yearbook editor, and so we shared a room with this teacher, and it was like a joined room. So you would open up a door, kind of like at a hotel, where you have separate rooms, but there's like this door you can walk through in between the suites or whatever. Right. It's kind of like that. And I dreamt about him after he died. He died of pancreatic cancer. And I dreamt about him for years after he died. And he would come to me the same way. We would always be out in nature somewhere, usually by a tree. We'd sit down. He'd catch me up, on what was going on the other side. And then say, can you tell my wife and my daughter that I'm okay, and I'm healthy. And I think he had been with his wife. I think they got married really young. They were 13.
Wow.
Yeah. I remember their love story being just this amazing thing, right? It's really young to get married, but for them it worked. And in hindsight, his life was cut short. And so it was beautiful that was their love story, But anyways, I dreamt about him for 2 years, and I kept having interactions with his wife out of the blue. I'm using quotations for those that can't see me. She would just be places that I was, and I never said anything. And so eventually Mr. Rogers kept coming. And it was actually the death of a friend, which a lot of people know about now because it's a story that I tell a lot, of losing Seth, my friend that I grew up with, that I hadn't seen in a handful of years, dreaming about him 2 weeks after his memorial service, passing that information on to his mom, it being extremely accurate. That set me on this, there's got to be more to this dreaming of dead people thing. And so I just kept picking up books. But my life was not conducive to it either. I was newly married and then newly pregnant and just like trying to figure it all out. And really, as I journeyed through my pregnancy with Dakota, our daughter, I became more and more sensitive, just more and more sensitive. And that eventually led me to going to a workshop.
About how old were you during this time?
21.
All right.
Yeah, so from 19 to 21, it was me just trying to figure out what the hell was going on and if I was crazy or not. So, so I went, I got in the car, left Dakota at 4 months old with her dad. I made my mother go with me because I'd never been anywhere by myself, and I certainly wasn't going to start now. I went to Austin. We drove to Austin to this beautiful retreat that's no longer there. I think it was called the Crossroads. And John Holland was there. And, I did his psychic workshop, and at the end of it, he came to me and he said, I really think there's more to you than just being a psychic. He was like, you do really good at this college called AFC in the UK. And I laughed. I literally laughed in John Holland's face. Just like this nervous laughter of, that's great. That's a fantasy. I'm never leaving Oklahoma. And then fast forward to about 3 years later, I ended up going. And that was a culture shock. And so our next episode actually is all about the Arthur Findlay College, but that gave me the basis of mediumship. And it gives you this very beautiful classic training, and you can always tell what I call a classical medium from someone who hasn't been trained there, because we all kind of deliver in a very similar style. But it's a style and it's a method of communication that actually works, and it's predictable. And then so at 23, after the first time that I went, because I've been several times, I then went and came home and I started a practice. Like, I opened up a practice of mediumship. And at the time in Tulsa, or in Oklahoma, I think in general, that was bad. I mean, you are now a target.
A target by whom?
By the community. By the community. And it wasn't just like one. You can't just say it was like one community, but anybody. I would get death threats, emails all the time. As soon as my website went up, I would get them regularly from Tulsans. People that were angry that I was doing this work. I worked at a little shop, and we had the window shot out while we were there. Wow. So that was pretty intense. And I knew then that things that had been said at the college, at AFC, to me, of being this pioneer and of having a place and needing to, kind of step into my calling, I kind of knew then that it was time. And that I needed to keep going. And so I kept putting myself in dangerous positions, not knowingly. Like my friends and I that were doing this work, shamanic work and things, we were invited to do, and I to this day, I don't know why they thought this would be a good idea, but they were like, let's do a spiritual fair in the Home and Garden Expo at the same time. So you got like all of these people here for home and garden shit. Right. And then you've got this little rectangle space of people who talk to dead people and want to help you journey and are really into crystals. And they were like, we want you to do a gallery every 3 hours. And I was like, that's a great idea. That was not a great idea, not for that venue. So you get up, and it was one of the only times I've been on an actual stage, which is terrifying because we do this work and we're up in the front of a room, right? Or in a church where you're by a pew, you know.
Mm-hmm.
By a pew? Yeah, by a pew. Anyways, I just remember all of these men congregating around the people that were there to watch and like be read as I'm on stage. And I, to this day, can still hear the shake in my voice as I am focusing on who this message is for, while I'm being screamed at, that I'm this abomination of God, that I'm going to hell, that I need to be raped, that I need to be murdered. And I remember going like, this was a bad idea. Like this was a really bad idea.
Wow.
But every year it got better and better. And so I just kept going. And then I started teaching almost immediately. So yeah, that's me. I have studied a lot about trauma recovery just due to my own journey and wanting to understand that. I have taken psychology classes, which is fun. But I'm kind of limited in anything outside of mediumship as far as being able to offer, this would be a good book to read about this, But with mediumship, I think I've realized I used to be very staunch about my beliefs and what I thought was possible and not possible. And the older I get, the more I realize I have no idea what's going on. I just don't. And that's okay. But my passion now is to just teach authentic mediumship and kind of see where it goes. So
That's lovely.
yeah, that's us.
That's us. It is.
That's a long ass episode, ladies and gentlemen.
Wow.
And 3 cuss words I've said in this podcast. I apologize. Well, Cris, thank you for taking the time out of your schedule. Because you
My
are
pleasure.
busy. So you'll be here for some episodes, but not all.
That's true.
It's all right, everybody. Don't be sad. It's okay. Yeah, hopefully we'll have you back on real soon. Back on our podcast real soon.
I'm looking forward to it.
You guys, thank you so much for listening. I hope that you found it at the very least intriguing. If you liked this episode, please feel free to subscribe to the Spiritual Banks podcast. We are on social media, both on Instagram and Facebook. Feel free to give us a like or a follow. As always, we appreciate any time you share the Spiritual Banks podcast. And if you'd like to give us a review. Until next time, we hope you know that the universe loves you, spirit loves you, and that we love you. Have a good day. Be well.